In 2007, my next guest started a television show dedicated to comics, science fiction, fantasy, and related media. The show now reaches over 4 million homes in the Northeast region. I'm hoping he's going to teach me how he did that. Ulysses Campbell, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
All right, I always like to start at the beginning. When did you first fall in love with the whole sci-fi comic genre?
Oh, since I was a very young boy. I used to love watching the old sci-fi movies on television and comic books. That's always sort of been a natural for me also. There was a sweet shop down the street from where my mom and I lived, and we were passing by one day, and I went in there and there was this giant-sized Batman comic book that was on the rack, and I made her buy it for her. I was in first grade.
Wow.
And that was kind of the start of that. But it always seemed kind of natural for me.
Yeah. What was the episode number or the comic book number? Do you remember?
Oh, you're going to ask me about that? I've actually looked it up.
Okay.
And I remember the cover. Off the top of my head, it might have been 124, but don't start me to lie. I don't remember it with that clarity. But,
right.
Yeah.
All right. So, you've been a comic book lover of the sci-fi genre, and then one day you just wake up and say, you know what, I want to start a TV show. Is that how it happened? What was the genesis for the show?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because I had an interest in community media for a number of years, and I lived in the District of Columbia, and of course there was a station there, and I had this flirtation with getting involved, but I hadn't actually followed through. And since nobody approached me to put me on television, I said, well, I guess I'll have to do this myself. But the decision to do the show really sprang out of some of the conversations that we had in the comic book store where I shopped every Wednesday when the new releases came out. I was standing around talking to some friends, and we were debating some different area of comics history or philosophy or current events or something like that. And it was a fairly interesting conversation, and I thought to myself, this would make a really interesting television show, discussion about this. And it didn't really come to fruition until one day because I was still working an office job at the time, and I left work early, happened to stop off at my local comic book store, which was in Georgetown at the time, and there were only 3 people in the store. It was just me, the manager, and this beautiful woman. And I looked around, because ordinarily, if you see a beautiful woman in a comic book store, it's because she's there with her husband or her boyfriend.
Right.
But it was just me and the manager and her. And so I went to the manager. I was like, yo, man, where's her husband and boyfriend or whatever? And he was like, dude, she doesn't have a husband or a boyfriend. She is here because she likes comic books. And I couldn't believe it. And as I came to know this young woman, I realized she was the X factor, because without her, it's just a bunch of fanboys looking stupid at each other. And, she was sort of that one critical piece that I felt was going to make the fanboys tune in. And I think it turned out just like that.
Wow. All right, so you've been doing this since 2007. I'm sure that, you've seen a lot and done a lot, and obviously to continue making the show happen, you had to learn some things along the way. What are some of those things that you've learned in doing Fantastic Forum?
It's probably not smart to do a show like this. No, in all seriousness, I had to initially take some classes at DCTV, because I knew very well, I shouldn't say, what I knew about television and video production was somewhat dated. So, and I didn't have my own equipment. That was, again, one of the benefits of community media that provided me access to the wonderful training and equipment and facilities that was going to make it possible to actually put this show on. So, but I had to take some classes, and then I had to actually go out and, because the show has several components. It's a segmented show. The primary component is a discussion among and between geeks. But we also do interviews with comics or media personalities. There is special events that we will go and cover. We'll do special features, parodies, and a toy and game profile. So, but you have to go and actually gather some of this other stuff. I mean, you're sitting in the studio because it was initially a studio produced show before we started going out on location and taping in our favorite comic book store. But You had to go to conventions to be able to get to the talent and conduct some of the interviews with the talent. You had to actually either go to some place like Toy Fair, where there were going to be a lot of the toys that were available that you could arrange to shoot, or people had to bring things from their own collection, into the studio so that they could be filmed. We had to find these various events that were of interest to be able to go out to. And there was always something new that you'd come across, and you have to make sure that you've got permission or otherwise cajole or arm twist or do whatever you need to do to be able to interest whomever in coming on or sharing their geek with us. And so that is, in essence, what we did, what we try to do.
Awesome. You're watching or listening to Picture Lock. I'm talking with the creator of Fantastic Forum. All right, Ulysses, so what is, or is there any significance in the title Fantastic Forum? How'd you come up with that?
Well, okay, I was thinking that, because there were a bunch of titles that I kicked around, and because it's a panel discussion, and we're talking about different topics of geek interest, I said, well, that sounds like a forum of sorts. And so, like I said, I played around with a couple of different names. The Washington, D.C. Comic Book Forum, Ulysses Campbell's Sci-Fi Forum, and a bunch of other stuff. And you are probably aware, because I know that you have some more than a passing interest in the genre, of a superhero team created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in the Marvel Universe called the Fantastic Four. Well, it hit me like a ton of bricks. What kind of forum is it? It's a fantastic forum. And right then I knew I had the name, because you had that connection to comics through that. And the way it rolled off your tongue, I felt like it was a nice little play on words that people would be able to remember. Now, as it turns out, it has not always been to our advantage to have that name. It's awfully close to Fantastic Four, and particularly when I have comic book artists or writers or media people doing drops for the show, invariably you hand them the mic and you say, okay, say your name and you're watching Fantastic Forum. And they say their name and you're watching Fantastic Four. It's like, no, try again, just like it says on the mic flag.
Right.
Fantastic Forum. Oh, yes, of course. I'm sorry. It's so close to Fantastic Four, I just said that.
All right, so, over the years, you've probably seen an evolution in regard to sci-fi shows as well as comic shows, right? So could you speak a little to that? Where do you think the genre is now? Because, for me personally, I love watching my Flash. I hate Arrow, but I love watching Flash. And, you're one of the guys that when you come into AIM, I can talk to you about it, but I can actually fact check with you and say, did this actually happen in the comic books? I just like watching it at this point. I don't necessarily have the comic book history knowledge. I have friends that do that. But what would you say about the evolution of shows like this?
Well, there are a number of excellent points that you raised, Kevin. And I think first and foremost is the fact that these various genres are now becoming mainstream. I mean, and you got to appreciate this, because this was something that was fringe for so long. I mean, when I was in second grade, I had to get a book bag because I was getting chased home from school, and you couldn't, you couldn't be carrying, something. You had to have something that you could strap on, and so you could really run and get away. And for so long, this was seen as, oh, you were a nerd, you were a geek, you were a loser, you were living in your parents' basement, couldn't get a job, couldn't get a girl, all this kind of thing, if you had an interest in some of these things. And the biggest change now is that you look at television, because this, show on CBS, with all the geeks, that's like the hottest show on television. You've got these movies that are coming out that are grossing over $1 billion worldwide. You've got all the preponderance of television shows on every network, the dramatic shows, action shows, and they're all about these characters. I mean, in fact, if you've got some kind of comic book character, you can get a license on this stuff. Somebody's going to want to make a movie or a TV show or something.
Right.
So, the fact that there are so many of these shows out there because, I mean, I can tell from the gray in my beard, you know, I mean, I've been around for a minute. And I remember the days when we got excited when a science fiction movie came out, I mean, because that was not a usual occurrence. And now it seems like, I don't want to say the majority, but there are certainly a high percentage of films that are being released both domestically and in the foreign markets that are right in this genre. They're either comic books or they're science fiction or they're fantasy, and these have been the biggest movies that you've had. You know, so I think that's very significant.
Yeah, I think you're definitely absolutely right. What would you say right now in terms of things like, you know, Deadpool just came out, right? And it's kind of like an anomaly. I think they got the tone right and all this kind of stuff. Do you think that we're going to see more films that are the rated R superhero films now that Deadpool, you know, did so well in the box office?
Well, you know, Deadpool wasn't the first R-rated film that has come out.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
you know, we've had a couple of little movies along the way, you know, called Blade and The Crow, you know, that have both had some very serious tone and content. And Blade in particular, and a lot of people aren't necessarily immediately aware of this, but Blade is the film that single-handedly saved Marvel, because you had what is essentially a C-list character at best, but you put him in this film, and all of a sudden, you know, hey, here he was, and people went to see it, and it did very well, over $1 million at the box office. So, you know, that's something else that's interesting, and it sort of harkens back to your earlier question, because the original source material of all this stuff has been popular for many years and still generates interest. But what's happening now is you've got these various movie properties that they may start with the original source material, but then you have a sequel that tends to draw more on the film, and then another sequel, and so maybe that draws more on the second film. And in essence, as you get further and further down the line, you get further and further away from the original source material. The other thing is the point of entry, because, you know, particularly given the fact that a character like Superman debuted in 1938 and Fantastic Four in 1961, but this is a lot of time between then and now, and so a lot of history, particularly given that most of these books were published on a monthly basis, and in some cases, like Superman, there were several books. He was in Action Comics and Superman and Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen and the Justice League of America and all these other things. So one of the things I understand that the film producers are starting to discover, since they have created this shared universe, is that, you know, all right, so you go to see Captain America the First Avenger, well, that's great. But then they have Captain America the Winter Soldier, they're getting ready to come out with Captain America Civil War.
Right.
Now, if you are more of a casual viewer who's just going to see Captain America Civil War, you're at something of a disadvantage if you aren't exactly familiar with Captain America the First Avenger or Winter Soldier. And so now the films are starting to have the same challenge, I don't want to call it a problem, but challenge that the comic books have had in terms of creating a point of entry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, obviously we could probably talk about this much more.
Certainly.
Yeah, it's
You're gonna have to have me back on.
Exactly. Hey, and then I gotta go be like sit in this Fantastic Forum panel one day. Just man, it's
one day
so
soon.
Cool. All right. How can people check out the show, watch the show if they want to?
Oh, bless you. Well, it happens to be on Arlington Independent Media. And you know, I'm going to encourage people to go to the AIM website, but also if you go to the website for the Fantastic Forum series, which is fantasticforum.tv, every month we update the program schedule for all the various stations that carry the show, hopefully one in your area. And you know, you can find out when it's on. You can also watch it through the website. You can also go to YouTube or Vimeo and watch episodes of the show.
Awesome, man. 4 million homes.
More than 4 million homes.
That's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah, you know, I wish it was making me some money.
I hear you on that one. Ulysses Campbell, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right. We'll take a short break and be back with Devin Gallagher. Don't go anywhere.